Hi. Today I wanted to talk about a young Earth creationist initiative that is spearheaded by the Institute for Creation Research called the Column Project. So if you have any familiarity with these projects done by ICR, you'll know that ones like the RAPE project had a $2.5 million budget, and these projects are often lauded as the forefront of creationist independent research, creationist published research. And ICR seldom fails to take advantage of talking about these projects and their successes. In fact, in a book that I have that was published in 2012 by ICR, they have a full 2 pages dedicated to what they expect the Column Project to bring forth. These were before the Column Project had totally taken off and accomplished all its goals. But nevertheless, they give nearly 2 full pages of text, 2 pages of maps, plus a very large chart, and they say that, quote, they see hints of long-standing solutions to many geologic problems. So they're putting a lot of eggs into the Column Project basket, at least back in 2012 when the Column Project was still young. And all of this stuff taken together, the reputation of ICR's projects, the optimism put forth in their published work, the budget. Well, I think it's worth doing a follow-up and seeing where exactly the Column Project has ended up, because at the RAPE project's conclusion a couple years ago, there were talks touring around the US. There were multiple sets of books and DVDs and manuals that were published related to it. There was dozens, maybe hundreds of articles published across basically every young Earth creationist resource website. And even today, young Earth creationists bring up the RAPE project in conversation. So before we can look at where the Column Project ended up, we need to understand what exactly the Column Project is. The official purpose of the Column Project is, quote, analyzing rock layers globally to reconstruct the stages of the Genesis flood and explain why certain fossils are found only in certain areas, and to determine the approximate topography of the pre-flood world. They explain that their methodology to accomplish this is, quote, analyzing over 500 drilling core samples and outcrop samples from across North America. In fact, the last official update on the project by ICR was in 2016. There's no published work related to the Column Project in any journals that I could find, and they don't mention it in their more recent books. So really the only way I could find to look at what the Column Project is accomplishing and what its output is was to look at various articles on the ICR website, and there are quite a few of these. So what exactly happened to the Column Project? Where did it go? Why has nothing been published? Well, fear not. To answer that, I have followed the breadcrumb. Well, fear not. To answer that, I have followed the breadcrumbs on the ICR website, tracking down blog posts, newsletters, anything I could find. Well, fear not. I have followed the breadcrumbs on the ICR website, tracking down newsletters, blog posts, convention details, to establish a more complete picture of what happened to the Column Project. So let's look at one of those blog posts. In a blog called Acts and Facts on the ICR website, Dr. Tim Clary, who heads the ICR Column Project, posted a short article titled Grappling with Megasequences. Now, the first thing that I noticed about this article when I opened it up is that it tries really hard to present itself as technical work. Not only is Dr. Clary's PhD presented in the byline of the article, but when you scroll to the bottom of the article, it has a cite this article feature. And the citation feature also puts his PhD next to his name. Now, I'm not sure what citation format this is. MLA and APA don't put the author's credentials next to their name when you cite them. In fact, I don't think this is an actual citation format. I think that ICR just really wanted to make sure that the 3 letters, the PhD, was next to Tim Clary's name in the citation as well as the byline of this article. But as far as citations go, that's not the only thing that I noticed with this article, right? This article uses 2 citations, but that's not the only weird thing about the citations on this article. It has 2 citations in total, both in like the first 3 to 4 paragraphs, And one of them doesn't actually have to do with the discussion here, but it's a link to another article that this author wrote that apparently he wants you to check out on dinosaur footprints. And then the other one, there's a passage in this that says, quote, according to secular geologists, and then they add a citation for that so that you know they're not misrepresenting secular geologists. But the citation goes to a book. Actually, it goes to this book, which is a young earth creationist work. So it doesn't really accomplish the goal of, making sure that we know that they're citing actual secular geologists and what actual secular geologists say. So the citations are definitely really weird and seem a bit, pseudo-technical, especially because there's two of them and they both go to ICR works and they're both like in the very start of the article. It's almost like when Dr. Clear was writing this, he was thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to include my PhD in the byline and I'm going to make this a super technical, super detailed resource. And then about, 5 paragraphs in, he kind of gave up and stopped trying to cite things. And I say pseudo-technical because he actually cites this article, this short web article, in other things that he's posted, in other articles and other overviews that he's posted about geology. So he's definitely trying to use this as like a legitimate authority or a legitimate article to cite, which is a little bit odd because it's really not an academic piece. The other strange thing about this article is that it's such a detour from the quoted mission of the Column Project, which was, remember, to analyze rock layers globally to reconstruct the stages of the Genesis flood and explain why certain fossils are only found in certain areas and to determine the approximate topography of the pre-flood world. But in the first couple sentences of this article, which is titled Grappling with Mega Sequences, it tells us that it is going to, quote, smash entrenched uniformitarian thought. So apparently they're taking a detour from talking about mega sequences to smash that. Well, wait a second. Uniformitarianism was abandoned in like the 1930s. So why exactly are they smashing that? Like, today's geologists are not uniformitarians. The only people who still use that word as a label within the field of geology are young earth creationists like ICR. But apparently we're smashing uniformitarianism now. So let's look at the argument that they use to do that. The argument that ICR uses is focusing on megasequences. In geology, megasequences can be defined as the effect of rising and falling sea levels on North American rock layers. There are 6 megasequences, and they represent a general pattern of shoreline deposits, then shallow deposits, then deep ocean deposits. But I've never actually heard of megasequences used as an argument for evolution or for deep time or for conventional geology before. Like, they don't really prove anything. They're an interesting artifact of North America's unique forming conditions, but nothing more. They're not like some massive cornerstone of evolutionary theory. And that's just talking about people who are involved in this young earth creationist controversy. ICR wants to paint it like every single scientist is engaged in this perpetual battle and is using these megasequences to convince themselves and you that the earth is old. Quote, secular geologists can't get around the reality of catastrophic flooding, but rather than entertain a worldwide deluge, they insist that it was all a result of isolated local floods. Or, quote, secular scientists use these megasequences to infer past environments and, of course, as an argument for deep time. Now, this is a place that I would actually really like a citation to make sure they're not misrepresenting secular geologists, because I've never heard of megasequences used as an argument for deep time or geologic time. I haven't even heard that from, apologists of evolution. ICR says that the supposed pattern of megasequences, where we have shoreline deposits, then coastal deposits, then deep ocean deposits, is actually not true. Quote, some megasequences start with limestone at the bottom and sandstone at the top, a complete reversal of the secular story. Then, ICR goes on to say that, in fact, megasequences are best explained by the flood. Quote, the megasequences show that the floodwaters seem to rise somewhat steadily across the continent. The waters may have dropped between megasequences, but may not have drained completely off the land. Wait a second, let's read that again. The megasequences show that the floodwaters seem to rise somewhat steadily across the continent, The waters may have dropped between megasequences, but may not have drained entirely off the land. So what ICR is claiming is that during the flood, the North American continent, at least partially and maybe totally, drained of water 6 times. It frustrates me to no end how creationists like to play around with their own scripture when it suits them. Right? Like when geologists suggest that there were local floods, they say, oh no, you're just saying that because you can't entertain the idea of a global flood. And then they gleefully point to verses that say the flood covered the peaks of the mountain. But when they need to explain contradictory rock layers, well, there's no verse that says the mountains weren't covered all the time. I mean, maybe North America just, dried out like 6 times in 100 days, right? That makes sense. And remember, megasequences aren't some cornerstone of conventional geology. If the young Earth creationists at ICR came up and proved that there was no such thing as megasequences, well, fine. We would drop the concept entirely, no harm, no foul. But then when we have this whole article with combative language about smashing entrenched thought and how secular geologists are using these as arguments for deep time and won't entertain a worldwide flood, you start to think that maybe ICR just doesn't have very much actual content or actual stuff to say about spearheading as your way to overturn conventional geology. So when you start to look at articles like this on the ICR website, you start to realize why exactly they aren't publishing anything based on the Column Project, because there's really not much here. There's not much to publish. Like I said, the output of this project is super low, even as far as articles on their website. But actually, if you go through the couple of blog posts a year that show up on their website mentioning the Column Project, if you read through them, most of them are arguing with other creationists, specifically on which rocks were deposited by the flood and which were deposited after, called the post-flood boundary. Just look at these titles. Rocks revealed the end of the flood. Whale fossils confirm post-flood boundary. Compelling evidence for an upper Cenozoic flood boundary. Paleontology confirms a late Cenozoic NQ flood boundary. Data leads to correct post-flood boundary. All of these are articles that are beefing with Answers in Genesis and trying to convince them based on the Column Project where the post-flood boundary was. And Dr. Joel Duff did a really good video on this topic and on the post-flood boundary and on this disagreement between Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research. So I'm going to link that in the description and on the screen above. So I recommend you check that out if you want to hear more about that, because there's not really much I could say about that wouldn't be repeating what he said. And this lack of output on the part of the Column Project is especially noticeable because, remember, ICR's purpose as an organization is to research this stuff and to share this stuff, right? If ICR had found evidence that smashed conventional geologic thought, they would be publishing that, they would be sharing that. And instead, I'm going crazy trying to find any kind of academic writing behind their, blog posts on their website. And in my searches, I actually did find something. For the 2018 International Conference on Creationism, Tim Clary wrote 2 articles that are at least in the format of technical papers. They don't actually give us any of the supplementary material for his project, but they do have some screenshots, and they're definitely the most in-depth reporting on the Column Project that I could find. And when you go through these papers, wow, you really see why ICR is not stopping the presses to publish all these smashing, groundbreaking, creation-proving results. One of the first things you'll notice is that, like the articles on their website, a lot of the focus for these papers presented at the 2018 conference are arguing with creation. In one of them, a large portion of the introduction is dedicated to talking about geologic column deniers. Similar to the topic of my last YouTube video, actually, that same concept of overthrusts and out-of-order rock layers is addressed in this introduction and thoroughly rejected. But apart from their arguments against the Creation Research Society and Whitcomb and Morris and Woodmarapp and Frode et al., this paper does have some really interesting conclusions. So, first of all, the title of this paper presented at the 2018 ICC is Global Stratigraphy and the Fossil Record Validate a Flood Origin for the Geologic Column. From their introduction, they say this: the goal of this paper is to explain how Much of the geologic column can be produced and explained by the activity of the flood, and further describe the depositional history of the Genesis flood without being dependent on the evolutionary geologic timescale, which are very lofty goals. Validating a flood origin for the geologic column is something that creationists have been trying to do for a long time. After that ambitious introduction, there are several pages of methodology and results that only mention the flood once or twice, and then we get to the discussion portion. In a small portion on fossil patterns in megasequences, it says, quote, "Although the intent of this study was to examine the validity of the megasequences independent of fossil content, we found that indeed, fossils also reflect a pattern and can be used as additional correlation tools, just as geologists have been doing since the days of William Smith in the early 19th century in England." This is massive. Young Earth creationists have been rejecting index fossils for centuries. In fact, if you look up index fossils on the ICR website, you'll see article after article rejecting them. How not to date a fossil. Out-of-place marine fossil disrupts evolutionary index. Rewriting the last dinosaur's tombstone. Archaeoraptor flight aborted. The profusion of living fossils. And more. In fact, out-of-order fossils, fossil graveyards, and living fossils have been key creationist arguments for a long time. And you see many of these arguments repeated on the ICR website itself. So to find in this article an admission that fossils reflect a pattern and can be used as an additional correlation tool is insane. But it doesn't stop there. This article has significant references to erosional surfaces at the top and base of megasequences. A common creationist argument has been to target gaps in the geologic column. There's a portion on this in the book, The Global Flood, where it explains that, quote, "The geologic column as normally presented should not be considered accurate history and should be recognized as a statement of evolutionary old Earth dogma because, quote, the rock records in these time periods are missing." So after targeting unconformities as a evolutionary plot device used to shore up missing gaps in the fossil record, to find them accepted in this paper is incredible. It's amazing how often this happens with young Earth creationist projects. The same thing happened with the Ray Project when it tried to debunk radioactive decay. This is how they ended their $2 million research report. Quote, "The conclusion that a large amount of decay has occurred has been denied or ignored previously by many creationists. However, the evidence is overwhelming. The magnitude of nuclear decay indicates that, independent of initial conditions, the equivalent of billions of years worth of nuclear decay has occurred during Earth's history. The only remaining avenue available appeared to be to question the assumption that nuclear decay rates have been constant." So often you'll hear from young Earth creationists that secular scientists don't look for themselves and believe things blindly. They'll say things like, quote, "Perhaps these authors have relied upon what others have said without carefully examining the formation for themselves. Unless geologists have reason to re-examine the widely accepted reports of other geologists, they usually rely on their claims without question." Creationists are fond of shouting, "The emperor has no clothes," and they're the only ones brave enough to point it out. So why is it that whenever they do these well-funded projects to prove that the emperor has no clothes, they always end up directly contradicting years and years of creationist dogma? Ultimately, the way ICR has treated the Column Project speaks volumes. All of the articles on their website that it blatantly contradicts are still up and still supported, and the results have never been published in any meaningful way. They'll show them to other creation scientists at the International Conference on Creation, but they won't show them to the public. Ultimately, how ICR chooses to present the results from their Column Project is up to them. I've linked everything I've talked about in the description so you can check it out for yourself if you want. Thank you for watching. Bye.